Thank you. I've got a question about the directness of the direct path, and it relates to the question I asked on Friday about the sense of being located behind the eyes. So, as I understand the direct path, its one basic claim is that the nature of me consciousness is always accessible, at least in principle. But if I understood you correctly, what you said on Friday, you said that this sense of a center I was talking about, or this sense being located behind the eyes, in most cases it takes a while before this is seen to be based on ignorance, or before it is seen to be an instance of ignorance. And I was just wondering whether this is not a kind of a qualification or limitation of the directness that the direct path speaks about. Because it seems that this insight does take time.
Yes, okay. Okay, so just first of all, to say something about the direct path. And for this I need John Smith and King Lear. Many of you are familiar with John Smith and King Lear. Just briefly for those that aren't, John Smith is an actor, and he lives a peaceful life at home, but on this occasion he's playing the part of King Lear. He goes to the theatre, he plays King Lear, and he loses himself so fully in the part of King Lear that he loses himself to the part, and when the play is over, he forgets to revert to John Smith. So his friend, who comes backstage to congratulate him on his performance, finds him miserable and says, "Why are you miserable?" And King Lear starts telling him about his relationships with his daughter. And his friend says to him, "No, you're not miserable because of your relationships with your daughter. You're miserable because you've forgotten who you really are. Who are you really?" And then King Lear starts telling him about his relationships. And his friend says, no, those relationships are not essential to you. And his friend asks him, who are you really? What is essential to you? What do you refer to when you say I, independent of all your thoughts and your feelings? So his friend is teaching King Lear self-inquiry. So his friend asks him to take the thought I and go to what you refer to as I. And so King Lear traces his experience all the way back to his essential, irreducible self, prior to his thoughts, feelings, relationships. And of course, at some point he realizes, I am John Smith. So that is the direct path. The distance between the I of King Lear, not the EYE, the letter I, the distance between the I of King Lear and the I of John Smith. That's the path. When King Lear says I, it is the path from that I to the I of John Smith. Now, how much distance is there between the I of King Lear and the I of John Smith? How long is that path? There's no distance. All there is to the I of King Lear, the self of King Lear, is the self of John Smith. King Lear is simply a limitation, self-assumed by John Smith. So I is what both John Smith and King Lear have in common. So the direct path is the pathless path, the effortless path from the I of King Lear to the I of John Smith. King Lear doesn't travel towards John Smith because King Lear is already John Smith. He is simply an imaginary limitation, self-assumed by John Smith. So King Lear doesn't engage in practices. His friend doesn't teach him mantra meditation. He doesn't tell him to go to a guru. He doesn't tell him to read books. He doesn't tell him to do japa. He doesn't tell him to do yoga. He doesn't tell him to do anything. All those methods would be the progressive path, and I'm not criticizing the progressive or the indirect path, but they are indirect means through which King Lear goes indirectly via a series of objects, mantras or whatever, back to his true nature. The direct path doesn't give us anything objective to do. We just go directly from the I that we seem to be to the I that we are. That is the direct path. And in fact, it is not a path because there is no distance between the self of King Lear and the self of John Smith. That is why it is said that the direct path is an effortless path, a pathless path, a directionless path. And indeed, it is why it is said it is the highest path, because it is the only path that is, we don't go indirectly via some kind of objective experience. Sooner or later, we have to come back to the I of John Smith, though in the direct path, we just go there directly. So a path that is not a path, it doesn't take time. So the question is enlightenment gradual or instantaneous? It's neither. That there simply is no time present in which this recognition of ourself takes place. So with that as a background to my response to your question about the gradual dissolution of the feeling that what I am is located just behind the eyes or in the chest, or it doesn't that seem to be some sort of a contradiction with the fact that the direct path doesn't take time? No, it's not, because this dissolution of the feeling of being located in and as the body is what Francis once referred to as a post-enlightenment sadhana. This exploration of the residues of the feeling of me in the body is something that takes place after we have recognized our true nature. It is not a prerequisite. It is not a means to recognizing our true nature. It is not in order to recognize our true nature, it is not necessary to explore the sensation behind the eyes or the feeling in the chest. It is only necessary to go directly to the experience of being aware, irrespective of the content of our experience. So although the direct path is direct and immediate, and to fully live the implications of our new understanding requires some exploration and takes time. So the realignment of the way we feel the body and perceive the world after we have recognized our essential nature takes time.
Yes, hello, thank you. I've got a question about the sense that things are at a distance from me in connection with the sense that I'm located behind the eyes. So when I try to investigate this sense, whether things are at a distance from me in meditations, I think I can follow the intellectual instructions, so to speak, sort of investigate that they are not at a distance from me consciousness. But then somehow what seems to be interfering is this sense of being located behind the eyes. So that somehow this creates this sense of things at a distance from that point. And I don't think it's a sensation. It's not a contraction in the forehead. It's really just like a point behind the eyes. And my question is whether this point can ever, so to speak, fall away, and whether that's what people mean when they speak. Sometimes they say, with awakening, the sense of a center falls away. Is that what they're talking about? The sense of a center, or the sense of a perspective of being here falls away? I hear that sometimes being said. Is that connected with this sense of being located behind the eyes, or is this something different?
Yes. Yes, the sense of being located in and limited to the body, either suddenly or in most cases gradually, dissolves. However, that doesn't put an end to the illusion that we see the world from the perspective of our body.
Yes, because...
Sorry to interrupt, if the Buddha was sitting here, he wouldn't be able to see the backs of your heads. He would see pretty much what I see. So the reason I use the Buddha, I'm using an impersonal representation of someone who has recognized their true nature. Still, the world still appears to them from the perspective of their body. But at the same time, they no longer feel that what they essentially are is contained within and limited to their body. It's just like when you have a dream at night and you dream of the streets of London, but you don't just view the streets of London in your dream from a kind of global perspective. You view the streets of London from the perspective of a separate subject of experience on the streets of London. So you see the streets of London from one point of view. In other words, your mind, you, the one asleep in your bed, your dreaming mind, has imagined the world within itself. But it can't see that world from a global perspective. It has to see that world from a location in that world. In other words, your mind has to collapse. Having imagined the world, it has to collapse into its own imagination as an apparently separate subject of experience and see its own creation from the point of view of someone in that world. So from the point of view of the character in the dream, the knowing, the awareness with which it knows the streets of London is located just behind its eyes. He shuts his eyes and he thinks the world disappears. London disappears. He opens his eyes. London appears again. He thinks, well, whatever it is that is seeing the streets of London must live just behind my eyes. And then he wakes up in the morning and realizes, no, whatever it is that knew my dream wasn't located in the head of one of the people in the dream. The entire dream took place in my mind. So it's like this imagine that consciousness now is asleep in its bed, dreaming your experience. It has collapsed, as it were, into your body, and it is viewing its own creation through your eyes, but it is not located behind your eyes. Now, the only difference between when we have a dream at night and consciousness's dream is that we have one dream at a time. But consciousness has the ability to have numerous dreams. So each of us are separate subjects of experience within consciousness's dream, through which it knows itself as the world. And in other words, consciousness has located itself as innumerable separate subjects of experience, through which it is able to know itself as the world. And that is the mechanism of manifestation. You cannot have an objective experience without a subject. You can't have just objective experience, because the object and the subject are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one side of a coin. You have to have two sides of a coin. If there is objective experience, there has to be a subject from which it seems to be known. That is the illusion. That illusion doesn't go away. Experience still appears to be in subject-object relationship. That illusion remains, but we wake up from the dream whilst continuing to dream. We still see our experience from the perspective of a body, but we no longer believe and, more importantly, feel that we are limited to that body. So
to clarify, so the sense of a center doesn't fall away completely. It is seen through as an illusion.
The
Is that right?
illusion remains,
Right.
but the ignorance, the belief and the feeling that I am something temporary and finite disappears. Occasionally it disappears dramatically and rapidly, but in most cases it dissolves slowly. But the illusion remains. It's not the illusion that disappears, it's ignorance that disappears. There's a difference between illusion and ignorance. When we, just to make this really clear, when we're watching TV, we see an illusion. When we're watching a movie, we see an illusion on the screen. It looks like a three-dimensional landscape. We go up to the screen, we touch it, we realize it's a two-dimensional screen. So the three-dimensional landscape is an illusion. Now, our knowledge that it is a two-dimensional screen doesn't get rid of the illusion. It gets rid of the ignorance. The illusion of the landscape remains, but we no longer believe that it really is a landscape. It appears as a landscape, but we know that it is a screen. The illusion remains, the ignorance goes. It's the same here. And this, for those of you that have come to this exploration through the Indian, the Vedantic approach, this explains what is meant by the word Maya, which some of you know is normally translated as illusion. But illusion has, the word Maya has two, in other words, Maya as an illusion is considered to be that which conceals reality. And that is the first and the most common translation of the word Maya, the illusion that veils reality. But there's another meaning, a deeper meaning of the word Maya, which is that it is the creative display of consciousness. We could say that the movie veils the screen, it conceals the screen. That's to begin with. We think it is a landscape, not a screen. But once it is clear to us that it is a screen, the previous illusion, the landscape, the illusion remains, but it no longer conceals the screen. In fact, on the contrary, the landscape shines with the presence of the screen. So the landscape no longer conceals the screen, it reveals the screen. It is the creative display of the screen. So the Maya is no longer an impediment to our realization. It is an expression of our understanding. All of this no longer conceals reality. It is shining with reality. All there is to this experience is the knowing of it, the consciousness of it. This is not veiling reality. It is shining with the knowing of it, with the reality of it. So these are the two different understandings of the word Maya. The first stage of understanding, Maya is translated as illusion. It is a concealing power. And then the deeper understanding of it is that it is the activity of consciousness. It is the continual, ever-changing revelation of consciousness. In the first, and both translations, both understandings of the word Maya are valid. I'm not meaning to preference one, I'm just putting them in their context. The first, the translation of Maya as illusion, we tend to find it more in the Vedantic tradition. And the second, the understanding of Maya as the creative display, the activity of consciousness, we find more in the Tantric traditions. They both have their part to play in the investigation into the nature of reality.
Thank you very much. I have a million questions, but I'll just keep it to like one for now. I'll be here all weekend. How important is a healthy lifestyle when, trying to awaken to the self or recognize the self?
A healthy lifestyle is not necessary in order to recognize the nature of yourself, but it tends to be an inevitable consequence of the recognition of yourself.
That's great, thank you.
Is that clear, or does that require some explanation? It's clear? Explanation? Just a brief explanation. Obviously not for you, but for brief explanation. What we call consciousness or awareness is that which is aware of experience. So, in order for consciousness to be aware of itself, it doesn't matter what experiences are present, because in order to know itself, consciousness doesn't need to direct the light of its knowing towards a thought, feeling, sensation, or perception. If consciousness wants to know about the body, it directs the light of its knowing, its attention, towards the body. If it wants to know about mathematics, it directs the light of its knowing, its attention, towards a thought. If it wants to know about the world, it directs its attention towards the world. So its knowledge of these things, thoughts, sensations, and perceptions, will depend upon the condition of those thoughts, sensations, and perceptions. But in order to know itself, it has to direct its attention towards itself, not towards thoughts, sensations, and perceptions. Thoughts, sensations, and perceptions tell us nothing about the nature of consciousness. It's like if the sun wants to illumine the earth, it shines its light towards the earth. If it wants to illumine, I'm caricaturing the sun, if it wants to illumine the moon, it shines its light towards the moon. But in order to know itself, it shines its light towards itself. In fact, it doesn't need to shine its light towards itself because its light is already with itself. It illuminates itself just by being itself. Consciousness is like that. If it wants to know about itself, in other words, if we want to know the nature of ourselves, we just have to give ourself our attention, not our thoughts, our feelings, it doesn't matter what our thoughts consist of. It doesn't matter what we're feeling. We could be deeply depressed or madly in love. Neither experiences tell us anything about our essential self. They tell us about our thoughts and feelings, but they don't tell us about ourself. So it doesn't matter whether we're madly in love or deeply depressed. If we turn our attention away from the depression or the being in love towards ourself, our experience of ourself would be the same in both cases. If you're deeply depressed one day, madly in love the next day, and on each of these 2 days you directed your attention towards yourself, you'd have exactly the same experience on each occasion. Because our self is that which knows the depression and being in love. So it doesn't matter whether we're deeply depressed or madly in love. Of course, it's much nicer to be madly in love. I'm not saying there's no difference between the two experiences, but in order for us to have knowledge of our essential self, it doesn't matter what is taking place in the mind, the body, or the world. So there are no prerequisites for the knowing of our own being. Our own being is equally available to all people at all times and under all circumstances. Now, the recognition of our own being, the recognition of what I essentially am, does have an impact on our lives. Because so many of the thoughts and feelings that propelled us towards certain types of activity, certain types of relationship, and certain substances, those thoughts and feelings begin to dissolve on the recognition of our true nature. And therefore the activities and relationships that were dependent upon them also begin to change. So that's why I said that our life circumstances don't have any... it's not necessary to change our life circumstances in any way in order to recognize our true nature, but the recognition of our true nature does have an impact on our life's circumstances.